It all started when Mary accidentally found an old doll in the attic. It was a worn, shabby item with tattered clothes and faded eyes that had once been bright blue. The doll looked very old, and it seemed that it had passed through many hands. But despite its appearance, something about this doll made Mary uneasy. Its gaze seemed to pierce straight into her soul, causing anxiety and discomfort. Without fully understanding why, Mary took the doll from the attic and brought it into her room. From the moment the doll entered the house, everything began to change. Mary started having nightmares at night. In these dreams, the doll came to life, its haggard eyes glowing in the dark, and a cruel smile lurked on its tiny lips. It moved around the room, its dress rustling on the floor, seemingly taunting Mary. These dreams were so real that Mary woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that the doll had actually moved. Mary began noticing strange things in real life too. Every morning she found the doll in a different place. One time, it was standing at the edge of her bed as if watching over her, and another time it was lying on the table with twisted limbs, as if caught in mid-motion. Mary tried to explain it away as coincidence, convincing herself that she simply didn't remember where she had placed the doll the night before. But the more strange things happened, the harder it was for her to believe that. Soon, even more terrifying things began to happen in the house. At night, footsteps could be heard in the hallway, quiet, barely audible, as if someone was creeping across the floor. The cabinet doors opened and closed on their own, and shadows flitted across the walls where there should have been none. Mary started hearing whispers coming from the doll, even when it lay motionless. The whisper was low, cold, and its words were indistinguishable, but each one made Mary's heart freeze with fear. One night, Mary woke up with the feeling that someone was watching her. Opening her eyes, she saw the doll standing by her bed. Its face was still lifeless, but its eyes seemed to look straight at Mary with an expression of hatred. Mary screamed and threw the doll into the corner, but it just lay on the floor, silently staring. From that moment on, Mary realized that something evil had taken residence in her house, and that something was connected to the doll. The next day, Mary decided to get rid of the doll. She took it outside and threw it into the trash bin, hoping that this would put an end to the nightmares. But as soon as she returned to the house, everything around her darkened, as if clouds had blocked out the sun. The wind outside picked up, and strange noises echoed through the house. Mary felt that her decision was a mistake, but it was too late. That night, Mary woke up to an intense cold. The room had become so cold that her breath turned into steam. She turned on the light and saw the doll lying directly on her chest. Mary screamed in horror and tossed it onto the floor. The doll, as if mocking her, rolled over and froze in a strange position. Its face bore a taunting smile, and its eyes gleamed in the light of the lamp. The next day, Mary decided to learn more about the doll. She reached out to an old neighbor who had lived in the area for many years. The neighbor told a terrifying story about how many years ago, a family had lived in that house. They had a little girl who loved her doll very much, but one day the girl mysteriously died and her spirit, according to rumors, inhabited the doll. Since then, the doll had brought misfortune to everyone who found it. Mary realized that the doll was not just a toy but a vessel for a malevolent spirit. She felt that her time was running out, and that the spirit of the girl was gradually consuming her mind. Mary became obsessed with the idea of getting rid of the doll, but she knew that ordinary methods wouldn't work. The doll seemed to be tied to her, and every time she tried to get rid of it, it would always return, no matter how hard she tried. Mary decided to turn to a priest, hoping he could help exorcise the evil spirit. The priest listened to her story carefully and agreed to help. He arrived at the house with holy water and prayers. But as soon as he approached the doll, it suddenly fell off the shelf and rolled across the floor as if on its own. The priest paled and said that this was no ordinary spirit, but something darker and more dangerous. The priest performed an exorcism, sprinkling the house and the doll with holy water. For a moment it seemed like it was over, but then the doll suddenly emitted a low, muffled sound as if someone was laughing. Mary saw its eyes glow with a sinister red light. The priest recoiled sharply and said that this entity was too powerful to be expelled by ordinary means. After the failed exorcism, Mary began to feel that she was losing her mind. The doll followed her everywhere she went. Mary tried to lock it in a closet, but in the morning the doll would always be next to her bed. She became afraid to stay alone and even began waking up in the middle of the night, terrified that the doll would kill her in her sleep. Mary stopped leaving the house. Her fear of the doll turned into paranoia. She began seeing shadows in the corners of the rooms, hearing whispers from nowhere, and feeling the touch of cold hands on her skin. Every time she looked in the mirror, it seemed like the doll was standing behind her. It was unbearable, but Mary couldn't change anything. One evening, Mary suddenly felt a strong pressure in her chest. She realized that it was not just fear but a physical attack. Her breathing became shallow, her heart pounded wildly, and she heard the doll whispering her name. It felt as if the spirit of the girl was invading her mind, taking control of her thoughts and body. Mary knew that if she didn't find a way to stop this, she would die. Mary reached out to the last possible solution she found: an occult expert online who specialized in exorcising spirits. This person agreed to help but warned that the risk was great and that not everything might go smoothly. He arrived at Mary's house with a set of ancient ritual items and began preparing for a complex ritual. The ritual began at midnight. The expert instructed Mary not to look at the doll, but she couldn't take her eyes off it. The doll lay on the table, surrounded by candles and herbs. The expert started chanting spells in an unfamiliar language, and the air in the room grew thick, as if saturated with an invisible force. The doll began to tremble and suddenly rose into the air. Mary felt her body become paralyzed. She couldn't move, she couldn't scream. Strange voices began to echo in her head, urging her to do something terrible. The doll, now floating in the air, emitted piercing sounds, and its face contorted into unimaginable grimaces. The expert struggled to maintain control of the situation, but the forces he encountered were too great. Suddenly, in the midst of the ritual, the windows in the house began to shake, the doors slammed shut, and all the lights in the room went out. Mary was gripped by primal terror. She realized that something had gone wrong. The doll, with a sinister giggle, fell back onto the table and froze. The expert abruptly stopped chanting and looked at Mary with horror in his eyes. He said that the ritual had failed and that now the spirit had fully possessed the doll. The expert quickly gathered his belongings and fled from the house, leaving Mary alone with the doll. He warned her that from this moment on, she was in mortal danger. Mary was left alone in the dark house, filled with despair and fear. She knew that the doll would now haunt her for the rest of her life. In her mind echoed the expert's words, "This evil cannot be stopped. It will be with you always." Days passed. Mary felt her mind slowly sinking into madness. She was tormented by nightmares every night, and in real life, she saw the doll moving on its own. Every step she took was accompanied by sinister laughter and whispers that only she could hear. It seemed that the doll was playing with her, making her suffer more and more each day. Mary decided to make one last desperate move. She took the doll and drove to an old abandoned temple on the outskirts of town. There, according to rumors, were forces that could help her get rid of the evil. As she entered, she felt the darkness envelop her from all sides. She placed the doll on the altar and began to pray, pleading with the forces of light for help. But instead of light, the temple filled with cold and darkness. The doll began to slowly rise above the altar, and shadows swirled around it. Mary felt the doll draining her life force, sucking out the last remnants of her will. She realized that her last step had been a mistake. This place, instead, strengthened the evil, and now Mary was completely under the doll's control. Mary's strength left her. She sank to her knees before the doll, understanding that she was doomed. The doll now fully controlled her mind and body. Mary could no longer resist. She stared into the doll's eyes, which now glowed with a bright red light. In that moment, she realized that her soul now belonged to this evil forever. Suddenly, the temple was filled with a wild wind. The shadows around the doll began to tighten, and with each movement, Mary felt her consciousness sinking deeper into darkness. Her body grew heavier, and she lost all sensation of it. Only the doll remained, staring at her mockingly, as if enjoying her suffering. The last thing Mary felt was a cold hand touching her face. The doll, now fully alive, approached her. It whispered words that Mary couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. She now belonged to this entity. Her life no longer mattered. She was merely a tool in the hands of the evil that was playing with her. Mary's body grew cold, but her mind remained trapped in the abyss of horror. She now saw the world through the doll's eyes, forever bound to it. Each new day was filled with pain and fear that never subsided. Her soul now wandered in darkness, powerless and alone, captive to this ancient curse. Time passed, but Mary's house remained abandoned. No one dared approach it anymore. People said that at night, faint whispers could be heard from inside, and flickering lights were seen in the windows. People avoided this place, knowing that something terrible and dangerous resided there. Over time, the house and the doll were forgotten. But the curse did not disappear. One day, a new resident, unaware of the terrifying history, bought the house. Shortly after moving in, he found the old doll in the attic. It seemed as though the doll had been waiting for this moment, and its eyes once again gleamed with a sinister light. From that moment on, the story repeated itself. The new owner began to notice strange events, whispers, footsteps that echoed at night, and the doll appeared more and more often in his sight. No one knew what awaited this person, but the spirit dwelling in the doll was impatient. It craved new victims, and now its game began anew. Mary's story remained just a grim memory, but her soul, trapped in this curse, continued to suffer. And until someone finds a way to destroy this doll for good, it will bring horror and death to anyone who dares to touch it. The curse, which seemed forgotten, will live on forever, finding new victims and plunging them into an abyss of horror and despair.